Well, a warm welcome to everyone tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. This is really exciting because it's the first in-person evening event that we have had for the new year, actually for a couple of years. And I'd like to wish everyone a very good evening in the audience here, but also in the virtual audience we have, which is very large this evening, and which sees people coming in from all over the world. So good morning, afternoon, and evening to those virtual participants wherever you are. My name is Anne Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs. It's my pleasure and absolute delight to welcome everyone to this year's annual Balsillie Lecture. Many in the audience will be aware of the mandate of the Balsillie School, which seeks solutions to humanity's critical challenges. The school is also a center of excellence located in the heart of Waterloo's intellectual square mile. It forms part of a very unique collaborative arrangement and partnership with the University of Waterloo, Wilfrid Laurier University, and the Center for International Governance Innovation. Residing in what we regard as the technology and scientific capital of Canada, we are very proud of the unique perspective that we bring to both in global governance and international public policy, one which is truly multidisciplinary and which brings together constellations of experts across both social science and humanities, and also a collection of STEM-based disciplines. This is absolutely vital for addressing contemporary issues in both governance and policy. Tonight's event, the annual Balsillie Lecture, hosts distinguished scholars and leaders whose work influences thinking on critical challenges to humanity. The speaker is an outstanding international personality who, in significant and innovative ways, contributes to a more just, peaceful, and environmentally sustainable world through valuable achievements in policy or research. Before I turn the floor over to Mr. Jim Balsillie, founder of the Balsillie School and our generous funder, to officially launch the event and to introduce today's distinguished guests, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. One of the actions we take here at the Balsillie School to advance reconciliation between settler and Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization which deeply impacts our work. We're very proud to acknowledge that the Balsillie School of International Affairs is situated on the traditional territory, the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It's particularly important that we here at the school acknowledge the land upon which we are situated in all we do, particularly important events such as this one tonight. It is now my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome Mr. Jim Balsillie, Canadian businessman, philanthropist, and the generous founder of this school. Jim, we are delighted to have you with us today to open this important event and to introduce our eminent Balsillie lecturer. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this lecture. Our guest tonight is Dr. John Hancock, whose presentation this evening is called, and I quote, "The Age of Anarchy, Navigating a World Where Everyone is Connected and No One is in Charge." Dr. Hancock is the Senior Policy Advisor to the President of the World Trade Organization in Geneva and is also its Head of Strategic Policy Development. He serves as the WTO's representative at both the IMF and the World Bank. He spearheaded the launch of the WTO's Aid for Trade initiative, as well as the recent joint initiatives on investment facilitation and other emerging issues. Prior to joining the WTO, John was a senior advisor to Canada's trade minister. He holds a PhD from Cambridge University and writes and speaks frequently on international issues. Today's lecture highlights an important topic in international affairs and one that is personal to me and this institution. CIGI was originally created to do research into important global institutions that supported the post-Cold War era. Even in our 20 years, those institutions, including the WTO, have been undergoing significant change and experiencing pressure. The old international system is struggling and a new, more diffused global system is emerging. Dr. Hancock will examine how unprecedented access to information, technological empowerment, and global integration is reshaping world politics, and ask what we can expect from a complex, turbulent global system that's increasingly run not by the G7 or the G20, but by the G8 billion. The accelerated pace of innovation and the digital transformation over the past 40 years has created a new kind of economy in which the basis of wealth and power is derived from the ownership of valuable intellectual property and the control of data. The degree and rapidity of this change is unprecedented in human history. It is most startlingly reflected in the stock market index tracking the value of the 500 most valuable companies today. In the mid-1970s, their intangible assets were 17%. Today, those assets are worth 92% and growing. IP and data assets have different features than traditional production goods, which present novel challenges for global institutional design. Traditional production economy benefited enormously from multilateral cooperation and free trade agreements. But in the digital era, we are witnessing a winner-take-all economy, great power politics, and the development of technologies whose dual use spills over into national security, social and democratic realms. The Balsillie School was created to seek answers and resolutions to crises and problems affecting humanity across the globe today. Every day, Anne and her team, our scholars and students, are playing an active role in informing relevant debates on international affairs. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Hancock to Waterloo and hear his perspective. Sir, the floor is yours.
Well, I hope this is working. First of all, thank you very much, Jim, for that generous introduction. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me and hosting me here. Thank you, Jatine, for organizing all this behind the scenes. I'm very grateful. I have to say, I am super impressed by this place. I mean, this is remarkable. Just the building alone is remarkable. And I love the way that it kind of physically clusters things. You know, you've got CG, you've got the Balsillie School, you're located in a university that's increasingly high tech, science, social, leading edge of social affairs. And the fact that you founded this, Jim, I think is really very impressive. I mean, I grew up with Jim as one of the superstars of the Canadian economy and sort of the young Turk of the tech world and changing the nature of how we communicate. You know, the BlackBerry was the original smartphone. And to take your financial support and build a foreign policy institute, I think is remarkable. I mean, it shows sort of a vision of how these things intersect and are mutually reinforcing. So I'm impressed by that, and I'm impressed by this. Anyway, let me start. I want to tell you a story. There was this couple, very nice couple, in their 60s, celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. And they were such a nice couple, and they'd lived such a generous and caring life with each other that the fairy godmother showed up at their 40th wedding anniversary and said, "You've been such a lovely couple, so caring, so lovely. I'm going to grant you each a wish." And they thought, wow, this is nice. I hadn't expected this. And the wife thought for a minute, and she goes, "Well, you know, I've never been on a cruise around the world. I've never seen the pyramids." And the fairy godmother said, "No problem." And she waved her magic wand, and shazam, 2 cruise line tickets were in the woman's hand. And the husband thought for a while. And he said, cruise around the world. And he said, "You know, I wouldn't mind a companion to go on that trip that's 30 years younger. I'd like a companion who's 30 years younger." And shazam, he turned 90. So the theme of my talk today is basically beware what you wish for, because it might come true. And I'm going to talk about the system I work in and the constellations of systems that came out of the Second World War. And the point I want to make is we're so used to talking about international organizations not succeeding or failing. My thesis tonight is they have succeeded. They've succeeded spectacularly, and in some respects are the victims of their own success. And as you know, those of you who know about WTO and the IMF, World Bank and the UN, you'll know that it came out of the chaos of the Second World War. And the economic insecurity and conflict that preceded it, the regional trade blocs of the 1930s, before that, the Great Depression and the stock market crash, the extraordinary unemployment that many felt had driven Germany and Italy and Japan towards fascism and away from democracy. All of those were in the minds of the architects of the system when they gathered to redesign the international system at the end of the Second World War. And as I'm sure you know, there's three kind of landmark conferences that helped design the system. There was the Bretton Woods Conference in the summer of 1944. There's the more famous San Francisco Conference in the following year, and where the UN is formed. And then there's the Havana Conference 2 years later, where they tried to form an international trade organization. I think of those three conferences, the one that's not talked about, but that's most important, was Bretton Woods. If our world today, if we look at our world today, the one that really shaped it were the profound decisions that took place in the 6 weeks in this extraordinary hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the Mount Washington Hotel. If you don't know the history, there was not much air travel. The war was still going on, and some of the biggest luminaries of the world, including John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, and others, convened at this relatively obscure railway hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and designed what was effectively the whole of the international economic system. And they did it in 6 weeks, which is phenomenal. And if you think about what was the guiding philosophy of that system, what did they want to achieve? There was a Cold War that was emerging. They had just come off fighting or were in the midst of ending a major war with Germany. There was an uneasy alliance between the great powers, Soviet Union, United States, and Great Britain. The lesson that they took, and especially the Americans took from that conflict, was that there can be no peace without prosperity. They saw the League of Nations, and it had multiple weaknesses or failures, but they assumed that the biggest failure was the inability to see that economics, in an almost Marxist sense, the underlying economic structure of the world, helps define the political superstructure. And if people are unemployed, if economies are declining, if countries are fighting trade wars and retreating into hostile trade blocs, if the international exchange rate system and the broader financial system is deeply unstable, the world will almost inexorably move into conflict and into war. And the ideas in the heart of the Roosevelt administration and the British, but especially the Roosevelt administration, was this idea that to build global peace, you've got to share global prosperity. They even used the phrase that Roosevelt had been using for the previous decade when his New Deal. He said, what the world needs is a new deal for the international community, a global New Deal. And this is the inspiration for the international system that comes out of Bretton Woods. So as we all know, the first pillar is the IMF. They create an IMF which tries to return the world to a stable fixed exchange rate, but it was highly ambitious. It was going to be an exchange rate. Keynes wanted an exchange rate fixed to the Bancor. He wanted to create a global currency with a global central bank. Talk about ambition. I mean, we're not even talking about that now. But Harry Dexter White and the Americans said, look, if we're funding this, it's going to be our dollar that's the anchor, not some British designed Bancor. The World Bank was designed around the opposite philosophy that had motivated countries in the aftermath of the First World War and the kind of revanchist policies that had driven countries in Versailles, in the Versailles Peace Treaty. Instead of penalizing your enemy, you would help to rebuild your enemy. Lloyd George had used the phrase in the aftermath of the First World War, we're going to squeeze them till the pips squeak. The World Bank was the opposite of that. We're going to offer soft loans and development assistance to help countries rebuild, to restructure, to get back on stream. Germany's going to get money. Japan's going to get money. They even offered the Soviets money and the Soviet bloc country money, but it was declined. You can say, well, cynically, they didn't really care about it. It wasn't an altruistic move. It wasn't really generosity driving the United States. It was the emerging Cold War, the threat of the Soviets, the fear that the Soviets would sweep into Eastern Europe, or the communist parties in Italy and Germany and elsewhere would rise up and lose Europe. That is possible. It doesn't change the fact that the whole philosophy was different. It was, how do we bring countries into the system? How do we build them, rebuild them? How do we give them a shared stake in prosperity? These were the motivating ideas behind the World Bank. And then there was my organization, or the precursor of my organization. And the idea was to meet later in Havana, set up a giant negotiation in the lead up to Havana to create an international trade organization. That was less successful than Bretton Woods. By that time, the kind of solidarity that had gone with the war and with the wartime allies was disappearing. There was a kind of a fatigue with institution building. They built the UN, they had created the IMF and the World Bank. There wasn't quite as much enthusiasm for trade. There were fears about what the Soviets wanted and whether the Soviets would embed themselves in the system would get distorted. So to make a long story short, the ITO, as you may know, never came into existence, and they created the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade instead. That was the design, that was the plan. And it was enormously successful. You have a period, it's almost impossible to conceive of this in terms of sheer numbers. A 36-fold growth in world trade between 1950 and today. 36 times over world trade grows. Even in recent periods, you'll have the US or Europe say, oh, we're not growing as fast as China, we're not getting as big. Between 1990 and today, the world economy, the Western economies tripled in size. And the world economy by a factor of world trade by a factor of 37. GDP goes sixfold, almost sevenfold. Per capita GDP globally is something like 3.5 or 3.5 times growth of per capita GDP. And the biggest story, I guess, is in the developing world. I mean, this isn't just a developed country story, especially in the last 3 decades. If you look at China, China alone has performed an economic miracle that's unprecedented in history. A nation of 1.4 billion people has been growing at an average of about 10% a year. Earlier on, almost 16, 17, 1 year, 18% a year, from Deng Xiaoping's great opening policy in 1979 to the present day. In China, in an early Mao period, in about just after the revolution and the Civil War, per capita GDP in China didn't even measure on World Bank's charts. It was so low. They had 96% of the population living on less than $2 a day, the definition of extreme poverty. The life expectancy of your average Chinese person in that era in the 1950s was about 33 or 34 years. Today, life expectancy, Don told me this, is higher than in the United States and China. They've gone from having 96% of the population living below extreme poverty. Now it's 2% of the population. That's how much things have changed. And I talk about China, but it's not just China. Vietnam, Cambodia, India, Brazil to some extent. The ripples are spreading out to Africa. I mean, right now, countries like Kenya or Tanzania are almost approaching double-digit growth rates. I don't want to present a utopian picture, but if you compare the world that existed in 1947, 45 in San Francisco, 44 with now, I guarantee you, none of the architects would have believed it was possible. None of them. They certainly wouldn't have dreamed that there'd be something called the G20, and there'd be the United States, the European Union, Germany, China, Russia isn't it? That's another subject we can talk about, but up until recently, Russia, Indonesia, all sitting around the same table discussing global economic cooperation. They certainly wouldn't have believed the kind of growth rates I've just described or the development. They didn't have a word for it back then. It was called internationalism or economic expansion. The word we use today is globalization. What they were looking for back then is what today we would call globalization. And it succeeded spectacularly. But as one of my colleagues always says, and I think it's a great phrase, I don't know where he got it from, he's a Nigerian colleague. He says, for every solution creates its own problems. You never reach a final solution. There's a new set of problems that emerge. And I think one of the best ways to think of the current system, the current international system, is that out of these extraordinary successes, there were at least 4 major tensions that emerged that so far we have not figured out how to resolve. And I'm not sure that there is a resolution. The first tension is the tension between what I would call internationalism or sovereignty, international sovereignty, and transnationalism, globalism. It's easy to forget that when that system was designed back in 1944, 45, 47, the name was an international system on purpose. It was nation states cooperating together to solve problems of world peace. And the nation part was key, as was the design of the Security Council and all the administrative structures of this system. It was specifically designed around the idea that countries are sovereign within their own borders and that other countries will guarantee that sovereignty. Inspired by the Westphalian system, inspired by the Congress of Vienna 100 years before in 1815, and found its expression in collective security in the League of Nations and was transplanted into the international system after the war. Everyone should protect and respect everyone else's sovereignty. That's one concept. But the success of this globalization project transcended those borders. You created issues that, by definition, didn't respect sovereignty, that spilled over from sovereignty. And we all know what those are, but it's worth listing them off. Climate change is a quintessential transnational problem. You cannot hive off a European atmosphere. You cannot create a Canadian atmosphere. You cannot fund climate-related low-carbon technologies in Norway and then not care less what happens to the rest of the world. It's like COVID, no one is safe until everyone's safe. COVID is another example, or the transnational movement of viruses and disease, fish stocks, migration, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, international finance, the internet. All of these things are transnational. And the system has never resolved this problem. So if you go to Russia, go to Serbia, go to China, and you say, what's the purpose of the international system? The purpose of the system is to protect our sovereignty and to respect it. You go to Canada, to Norway, to Finland, they say, no, that's not the purpose of the system. The purpose is to coordinate across borders. The purpose of the system is to hold countries accountable. The purpose of the system, if you believe in right to protect, is to reach inside borders and say, if you're polluting someone else, you have to change your way. If you're abusing your own citizens, your government's got to go. So that's the first tension that we haven't resolved. The second tension is what I call the conflict, and it's a conflict that's been around for ever since liberal democracy took hold in the world. It's the conflict between liberalism on the one hand and democracy on the other. We always use these terms almost interchangeably and assume that they're yoked together. And they are related values, but they're not the same. And as Isaiah Berlin told us or warned us years ago in his famous essay, Two Notions of Liberalism, often these goods, these values conflict. So if you have a hyper-liberal world, a liberal of free markets, of rewards to merit and innovation, it can result in a highly unequal world. And it could require a limitation of government, stopping governments from doing certain things. Equally, if you value a equal world, a more democratic world, it could involve a much bigger redistributive state, an interventionist state, and a curtailment of liberty. So in today's international system, we have these conflicts. We have them, of course, playing out in our own domestic, in our own countries. The right typically, or at least used to, favor freer markets, small government, let the rewards go to merit and ability and innovation. And the left typically favors redistribution, greater equality, curtailing the market, holding back. The problem is it's not just a national problem. It's a global problem now. How do you share out the benefits and costs of this globalized economy we've created, this kind of hyper-liberal economy we've created? How do you ensure that countries that even geographically lose, almost by definition, geography matters in economics, are compensated or at least not completely marginalized by countries that are growing much faster and have much greater wealth? And this same debate, of course, is going to surface hugely in climate change and in the environmental debate, where the poorer South will immediately say, whatever happened to the principle of polluter pay? Why should we curtail our growth or hold back our development because of the problems you created? We need some compensation. We need finance. We need equity as opposed to just efficiency. Share your technology, share your money. But at the root of it is this tension between liberalism on the one hand and equality or democracy on the other. Another tension I think that's worth talking about, I think is relevant to this discussion, is what I would call the tension between a globally integrated market and the rapid decentralization of economic power and the dispersion of economic power. They are two very different things, but they seem to go hand in hand. We've created a world, this kind of globalized world that was dreamed of in the 1940s. What we've created is something that sometimes looks so decentralized, so dispersed, so diffused, but also interconnected that it seems outside of global control or outside of the remit of international organizations to oversee or to manage. Trade would be one example. Trade system, just to illustrate it, it kind of boggles the mind. Every year, everywhere in the world, there are something like 17 million containers. And at any one time, any one day, there's 6 or 7 million circulating around the planet, million. They're in those giant steel boxes come all of our stuff. Everything from, the shampoos you might use or batteries you put in your flashlight, all the way up to, advanced electronics or laptops or telephones in these metal boxes. 20 million alone land on the shores of the United States. One of the shocking things about the COVID crisis was when you asked multinational corporations, where do you get your supplies? Where does your supply chain originate? They didn't know. It was shocking. They maybe could go 2 or 3, maximum 4 steps back in the chain. But after that, the chain kind of disappeared into a black box called the global free market. And they didn't know where it came from. It didn't really bother them very much until suddenly there were no microchips to put in their cars, or there were shortages of other critical supplies like fertilizers. And someone's like, well, wait a second, where's this coming from? Why don't we know where our supply chain is? It's because the supply chain had become so dispersed, so interconnected, and worked so seamlessly well that most corporations just didn't worry about it. Finance is even more complex, integrated, and in a sense autonomous. I don't have this memorized, so I'm going to read it off to you. The daily, I'm going to throw this out. Daily trading volume on the New York Stock Exchange averages between 2 billion and 6 billion shares a day, daily. The only way to deal with a market that complex, that integrated, and that fast changing is through automation. They have essentially handed off large amounts of analysis and decision-making to machines and to algorithms. That level of automation in turn increases the complexity of the financial system, which in turn requires more automation, more integration, greater complexity. Just to put it into perspective, while human traders would have traditionally averaged 5 trades a day, go back 30 years, high frequency trading algorithms can make 10,000 trades every second, 5 a day versus 10,000 a second. And that's not even talking about the internet and the complex software and hardware infrastructure that makes all of that trade and international financial transactions happen. I mean, we all have a picture of what the internet is. We talk about the World Wide Web, but does anyone actually know how it works? Maybe there's a handful of people in the world that have a global comprehensive picture, but I actually kind of doubt it. We might know a piece of it. We might know our particular area, but we have created a system that's so complex thanks to this highly free, decentralized global economic system that it's essentially beyond people's control. And the last tension I want to mention is probably, I think, the most dangerous or destabilizing. And that's the tension between a world that sees international relations in terms of economics and positive sum relationships, and a world that sees it in terms of security and defense interests and zero-sum relationships. And I'll explain what I mean by this. So if you're a classic trade economist or financial finance person, you will see trade as a win-win proposition. Not that everyone benefits the same from trade, not that some people don't benefit more, but no one really loses from it. A rising tide lifts all ships. It's core to Adam Smith's theory of comparative advantage. It's core to how we've structured our trade relationships, how these supply chains that I just described work. And it kind of explains why the Chinas and the Indias and the Brazils have risen as quickly as they had. And that kind of vision of global integration and trade lifting all boats made sense if you shared an equally powerful idea that came out of the Bretton Woods system, which is peace depends on prosperity. Countries that trade together won't go to war with each other. Integration gives us a stake in each other's success and stability. If everyone gets prosperous and has a job, if we all have a house, if we all have enough to eat, or the Macmillan line, if there's a chicken in every pot, if your kids can go to college, apologies for being sexist about this, if young men get married and have a family, as opposed to remaining unemployed and joining armies or joining terrorist organizations, if all of that comes together, if the American vision is we want to make the world like Boise, Idaho, we're all going to be developed together. That vision works in 1944, when you sit on 60% of the world's gold reserves, when 50% of world production is happening in the United States, when everyone needs dollars to rebuild and to buy your products, when you're unambiguously number one, it's a system that you designed and you are the one country to rule them all, then it makes sense. So we have these tensions, and no one really has an easy answer to solving them. At the end of the Second World War, globalization was driven by two things, two very different things. One was ideology, the ideology I'm describing, of globalization, of peace depends on prosperity, integration binds us together, countries get rich together, we'll all converge on a liberal democratic model and we'll be happy forevermore. The ideology, that's gone. That's unraveled. That doesn't exist anymore. The governing consensus that bound the whole international system is falling apart. The problem is the other, even more powerful driver hasn't stopped. and that's technology. In so many ways, our world is still being driven together because our vision decentralized it, diffused it, gave power to the private sector, gave power to multinationals and to people and to consumers. So you have, on the one hand, an international architecture that was going to manage it and encouraging, that has become broken or is unraveling or is fracturing. And you have underlying technological pressures which continue to push the world closer together. It's a statistic, but it says it all. So you have the United States talking about friendshoring, about creating regional trade blocs amongst allies, of bringing manufacturing back home, of being wary of China. China is a strategic competitor. And while they're saying that, trade with China actually went up by about 5 or 6% last year. Europe trades more with China than it's ever traded. And you can't say, oh, that's because, State Department's lying to us, or because USTR has. It's because they're not really in control anymore. They've decentralized it. They've allowed the market to happen on its own. They've allowed globalization to be on autopilot. So what does that mean about the world we're in? And where does that leave us? There's a Milton Friedman, the economist and Chicago school economist, and some people love him or hate him. But he had a lovely lecture he gave called The Miracle of the Pencil. Has anyone ever seen this Miracle of the Pencil lecture? But it's really worth digging up if you haven't seen it. And just to give you an idea, his basic speech is, he says, the humble pencil. I had a pencil to show you, the yellow ones with the eraser at the end and the graphite lead. The humble pencil. No one could make it on their own if they lived 100 years. The lead comes from mines in Australia. The wood comes from forests in Brazil. The paint is produced by a company in Holland. The eraser head, who knows where it comes from? Malaysia with its rubber plantations. Maybe it comes from a rubber plantation in Africa. It doesn't matter. All of these pieces come together almost magically to form the pencil. And not only does they come together to form the pencil, it comes from countries that don't speak the same language. It comes from countries that don't have the same religion. It might even come from countries that don't even like each other very much, or that are on the edge of a conflict or a border dispute. It doesn't matter. It still comes together to form the pencil. And the most amazing thing Milton Friedman points out is that no one's in control. There's no commissar or director general of pencil making sitting in the UN saying, this is how you make a pencil. This is how you pull it all together. This is where you sell the final product. It happens almost magically, the magic of the pencil. I think that's kind of what our world is right now. This is what's happening in the world. And it's not just happening on the level of pencils. It's happening on the level of everything. Everything we do that transcends borders, transcends our jurisdictions. We have a globalization on autopilot. There's theoretical words for it that might explain what's going on. Von Hayek, the great Austrian economist, he used to talk about this concept called spontaneous order. He had this idea, which he took from Adam Smith, who took it from David Hume, that most things humans do don't happen because someone told them to do it, or someone planned it, or because there were policies or laws that made it happen. They just happen automatically. We tend to coordinate it almost instinctively. When you walk down the sidewalk and you're coming towards it, I know there's going to be instances where you both go the same direction, but most of the time we know where we're going. Have you ever discovered the phenomenon where the traffic light doesn't work anymore? It's on the blink, something's gone wrong, or they're repairing the wires. And weirdly, the traffic works better because humans just naturally sort themselves out. That's kind of where we are on globalization right now. The great institutions are paralyzed. The national governments are suspicious. The trust is low and declining. And yet, the system keeps going. It keeps churning over. It keeps as in my case of the US-China, it expands. So that's the good news. The bad news is there are some things we need to do reflected in those tensions that can't happen just through markets and through spontaneous cooperation. And because city-states are talking to each other, or universities are talking to each other, or because multinationals coordinate things within their own supply chains or ecosystems. There are some things that are just going to require cooperation on a global level. The environment and climate change. I don't see a solution to that that doesn't involve at least some level of cooperation and coordination. Nuclear proliferation. You know, it's if you leave it to every man for himself world or every woman for herself world, if there's no attempt internationally to try to stop these things or to limit their spread, they will spread. Migration, plastics pollution, the spread of disease and illness, as we proved in COVID. At some level, there's some things an international system exists to do. And right now, it's not doing it. We had a discussion at dinner before about what's going to come out of this. I don't have an answer because right now, I don't think there is an answer. All I can say is what you're doing, this institute, the Balsillie School, the kind of philosophy that guides you, the investments you're putting into your education and your perspective on the world is part of the solution. My final point I'm going to make to play off to try to dilute the pessimism is this. I think, and when all is said and done, the most important element or quality guiding international relations is knowledge. It's fundamental to everything we do. It's fundamental to our economies. You know, we all think, oh, you just go and there's coal in the ground, or there's lumber to cut, or there's firms that miraculously happen out of nowhere. Nothing we do is not dependent on knowledge and human ingenuity. And despite the tensions I've described and the complexity of the world we're living in, I think we're living in an era of extraordinary knowledge development and diffusion. So if there was an answer to this, it's events like this, it's schools like this, it's learning how to talk across borders and cooperate, it's visiting foreign countries and doing a year abroad, it's inviting foreigners and immigrants and migrants into your own country and learning from them. And it's maybe a little bit of humility to say we don't have all of the answers, but through this process of talking to each other, sharing information and ideas, adding to the body of knowledge and understanding where we are today, that we're going to have some sort of cooperation. Anyway, that's all I have to say. I hope I didn't depress everyone. I'd be happy to take some questions. Jatin, I think you're going to come up with me and answer some questions. So thank you very much. Jatin.
Thank you, John, for a thoughtful, thought-provoking, incisive, penetrating analysis of our current conundrums, whether it's trade and so on. And I'd just like to pick up on a point that you ended with. And often I say, the light that emerges is not out of the electrons of rotating machines that get transmitted over transmission systems, and we see light. But it is the knowledge behind it that is the true light. And that, I think, is the hopeful note that you ended with. I'd like to pick up on that. My name is Jatin Nathwani. I work with John, lead the STEM for Global Resilience research cluster here at the Balsillie School. And I'm delighted to join you. This is the time for you to ask questions. So I welcome members of the audience present here to step up to the microphones, and any questions you may want to raise, any perspectives you may want to share and reflect upon what John has just delivered in a very eloquent lecture. And for those of our audience who are with us virtually, you can also ask a question through the Q&A function on your Zoom. And Anne here will be monitoring your questions. And she will then translate those questions to me here on the stage so that we can have a very productive and interesting discussion. So I look forward to your comments, and please just step up to the microphones if you have a question, anyone from the audience right away. And if not, then I will always have a question for John.
And don't be afraid to say, that was just rubbish, or I utterly disagree with you. One huge advantage of working in a place like the WTO, which is, I say to my kids, when my kids were younger, I used to say I worked at the WTO, and they were so proud of their dad until they went to school, and everyone hated the WTO, and it was like working for the Ku Klux Klan. So the one advantage of that is you get a really tough skin, and almost nothing that can be hurled at you is going to hurt you or make you feel badly.
So yes, you have a question, please step up. Yes.
So I'm not part of this school. I'm in engineering. So I don't know much about world trade. But I know I'm learning a little bit about like long-term futures. And it seems like growth is often touted as a good thing, kind of the goal for everyone. But like unreined growth is going to lead to depletion, and everyone will starve. So in terms of the long-term future for the world economy, where do you think we can go?
Good.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much. That's a great question. And I've heard this question before, and it's not, I was actually at a conference last week where exactly the same point was made. Have we reached not just the limits of growth, should we limit growth? I mean, should we just say, that's it, we're stopping now, we've got enough stuff? I have two answers to that question. One, again, it's going to draw on my children and their friends, and the other is a more serious answer. The first is, when I was 16, when I turned 16 in Nova Scotia, the first thing I did, I got up early in the morning, I went down to the registry of motor vehicles. I stood outside the door waiting for it to open so I could get my beginner's driver's license. I was thrilled. And then I launched a campaign in my family to get my dad to buy a lousy secondhand, I think it was a Maverick, so we'd have a car to drive. And that was true of all my generation of young people, or almost all of them. And we do really boring things in the evening, like the one friend who had a car, we'd pile in the car and then we'd drive around the city and we'd go to McDonald's. My point is, my kids and their friends, I have to try to push my daughter to get her driver's license, and she still doesn't have it. They have no desire to own a car. They don't buy magazines with autos in there or go to the auto show. They have a phone. That seems to be the thing that's most important to them, or their material symbol of freedom. But even then, I don't think they don't want to update their phone or get the newest model. They like intangible things. They watch movies on Netflix. They play games in a virtual universe. They talk online with their friends. They download things on their Kindle. I'm not trying to say they're perfect, but this seems to be more and more what their generation wants, partly because they're aware of exactly your question, the danger. And what I'm trying to say is growth doesn't have to be stuff. Growth is just economic progress and what we value. And if we as a species, and millions and billions of us, start valuing things like virtual movies that are weightless and intangible and don't cause any kind of climate crisis, versus my red belching steel-intensive Mustang Ford Maverick, it's still growth, and it still requires ingenuity and innovation and production, but it doesn't have as big an environmental footprint. My other point to your point, and this I think is more depressing, is it's typically this question, and it's a totally legitimate question, comes from the West. If you go to Indonesia, if you go to Congo, if you go to India, the poorer parts of India, and say, you know what, guys, the planet's suffering. We can't grow anymore, and sorry, you missed out. You should have done it 50 years ago. You can't grow anymore. You're going to just have to stop right there. No stuff for you. You know, no trips on airplanes, no new cars, no new phones. Just stop, because we've polluted the planet so much that we all have to just rein in and time. And it's not a saleable argument. It's right. We have to change growth. We have to figure out a way of growing without destroying the environment or producing carbon or polluting plastics or whatever. But I guess my simplistic answer to that, ironically, growth caused the problem and growth's going to be the answer. Technology is going to be the answer. Innovation is going to be the answer. The green transition, energy transition is going to be the answer. But it's not to say, stop, no more progress, no more technology. That's my simple answer. I know it's not a satisfying one, but that's what I would argue.
Is there a question from the virtual?
Yes, there are several. So Ted would like to know, what can Canada do to improve its standing on the world stage, be it on trade or through multilateral organizations like the WTO?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't have any super easy answers. This is one of the answers. Train the next generation of diplomats and foreign policy experts and researchers on international relations. I think that's part of the answer. Part of the answer is we as a country have to invest heavily in our diplomats and in our foreign service. And that is not a popular line, but you know, it's a cheap investment. I go to these meetings. Everyone knows the ambassadors who are, if she gives a great speech or a great intervention or has a great point, and she's from Jamaica, suddenly Jamaica goes up in everyone's estimation. Suddenly Jamaica gets invited into the back room to make a deal. And if you're just not very effective, or you aren't very diplomatic, or you don't know your file, you're not an expert, no one listens to you. And you could be Indonesia, whatever it is, 250 million people. You can be, some countries punch above their weight, some punch below their weight. So I think Canada, you have to invest in global affairs. Do you know what I think is the best set of diplomats on the planet right now? Singapore. They're outstanding. They're extraordinary. They know every file. They're a little city state and they know every file. They're experts. Everyone trusts them. Why? Because they're Singapore. You can't afford not to have a foreign policy. You can't afford not to know global finance or global environment. Or you can't have the luxury of just sitting back in a giant continental country like the United States and saying, well, the world will come to us and we're all right on our own. Canada is too, though. We need to have a foreign policy and foreign policy experts. And the last thing I'd say is our brand is still great. I think we're living off it a bit too long. And sometimes if you really peel back the curtain, maybe we're not as good as the world thinks we are. But right now, the world thinks we're great, and they're willing to give us the benefit of the doubt. So we shouldn't squander our brand. We should invest in it. I don't know if that's a fair answer.
You stood up there. Did you have a question?
I have a question. Earlier, you said you don't have much answers yourself, so I won't ask a straight question. I'll ask for your wisdom instead. And it's about lifestyle. What should I make time for every day? A man in your position, I'm sure.
That is a great question. I've never been asked that question before. I don't know. I mean, at one level, I think you're the young man. I'm the old man. You probably have a better answer to this than yourself. But I'll give you a ripped off answer, but I thought it was brilliant. And I think I read this on the internet somewhere, but I really believe it. And when I read it, I wrote it down because I thought it was such a clever answer. I think it was Buffett. I'm going to forget his name. Warren Buffett. Read all the time. And don't just read, something off of a website and give it 2 seconds of your time and then flick to the next website and to the next one or whatever someone sent you on the Instagram feed. Read real books and give yourself a goal of, I'm going to read a book a week or every 2 weeks. Honestly, it's the best investment you can make in your future, because I guarantee you, most of the other people in the room won't be reading a book every 2 weeks. So you'll look like the cleverest person in the room. It makes you think. There's something about reading versus listening to a podcast that's better. And honestly, it's back to what Jatin was saying. In the end, it's all about knowledge. It's all about human capital. It's all about what we know. And that includes even cynical things like jobs, right? I'm sorry, where I live right now, Geneva, they're pretty well off. It's a rich country and it's got nothing. They have chocolate. They made, you know, the famous third man line from Orson, was it H.G. Wells? Or, yeah, Orson Welles, the ancient movie Third Man, where they said, you know, Italy had wars and bloodshed and torture, but they create Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, and Switzerland had 500 years of world peace, and what did they create? The cuckoo clock. That's actually not true. Switzerland is a highly successful country, and they have no gold in the ground, and they have no oil, and they have mountains instead of fields and trees. Why? Because they're smart, and they put a huge emphasis on education, and they have high skills that the world wants, and as a result, they have a hugely disproportionately well-off country, which is the reading and skills point, as opposed to you know, countries where, for whatever reason, they don't value education, or people, I said, are so poor that they don't have any time to read books. They literally are just struggling to stay on the plane that they've got. But I hope you don't think that's a superficial answer. I actually mean it. Read books. That would be my advice.
Singapore is an excellent example of that.
It really is,
you know,
because again,
knowledge-based,
nothing.
Nothing, but what have they created? Enormous wealth.
It's your brain. Yeah. That's what creates things.
We'll go to the next one on the.
Okay, and there's some coming in from the other side of the world, which I'll touch on as well, because two of them are very similar. Listening to your lecture, John, a term which is gaining currency these days is deglobalization, a kind of reversal of globalization or slowbalization. Do you think it's here to stay? And related to that, someone who's interested in your point on how technology is bringing the world together. It seems like technology is further dividing the world as well, with Chinese associated companies, Huawei and TikTok, cyber warfare, race for space, theft. How does the world come to a consensus on the rapid proliferation of technology to automate jobs and weapons development? And there's a related question in line with that on AI, the role of AI.
Great questions. Okay, let me try to unpack them. Deglobalization. You know, I don't have an answer because I think it's uncertain right now. I think that was what my lecture was trying to say. We're paralyzed at the political and ideological level, but at the technological level and the structural level, it continues to integrate. So it's out of control. It's beyond anyone's control. It's happening automatically. You know, it's worth it. Just put on a historian's hat for a second. The history of the last 200 plus years is a history of ever widening and deepening integration and cooperation. It's just the way the world's gone. If you go back to before the Napoleonic War, and it coincides with the Industrial Revolution, right? The inventions, steamships, steam rail, telegraph, all these technologies start binding people together. Even where I live, you know, Switzerland. You go to Switzerland, it wasn't a tourist destination because no one could get there. And then suddenly the railway is invented and it becomes a tourist destination. You grew up in Switzerland, you could literally see how the Swiss economy developed. Your radius was 20 kilometers, basically the distance you could walk or your horse. You married everyone from within that 20-mile radius. Your job was in that 20-mile radius. Your family was in that 20-mile radius. The moment you have steamships, the moment you have rail, the moment you have telegraph, and then of course, airplanes, cars, mobile phones, your vista becomes global. So the history of the world systematically is ever more globalization, except 1914 to 1945. And you have the three horsemen of the apocalypse. First World War, Great Depression, Second World War, deglobalization, massive deglobalization. And where did that get us? 20 million dead in the First World War. Almost 90 million dead in the Second World War. The Holocaust. massive ethnic cleansing across Europe. People had so little to eat that, you know, you go to Holland today, you can tell which generation lived through the war because they're shorter, they just didn't have the nutrition. So anyone who says deglobalization is a good idea, I have to say, I think it's a terrible idea. It's really a bad idea. And it's because, and this is something that only diplomats or lawyers or out of touch people like me could say, well, we're not going to deglobalize everything. We're just going to deglobalize this sector, the strategic sectors, you know, chips or computers. Well, immediately you think, well, how do you do that? You know, we're going to still trade the machines that make chips, or we're still going to trade the inputs that make chips, or how do people get to move back and forth, or do they stop too? You can't trade them. And by the way, what's strategic is our, you know, our mobile phone strategic, our shoes strategic, is food strategic? A lot of people would say food is energy strategic. Where does the strategic thing stop? But the worst part, I think, is it's like a divorce. Every divorce, not every divorce, I've never been divorced, but a lot of divorces, oh, it's going to be amicable. We'll be great friends. We're just going to get divorced. We'll figure out what we're going to do with kids. And by the end, they're at each other's throats. It's, you know, once you start decoupling, the divorce analogy is good. It becomes kind of acrimonious. And that's what happened in the 1930s. What started out as limited decoupling it turned into a war. And we see signs of it. I'm honestly, the China-US thing, I've been in the WTO since it started. You could see it coming, but it happened so fast. They were talking to each other, they were cooperating, and then suddenly it just got worse and worse and worse. And don't trust public opinion. Look at the Pew research. They do wonderful jobs of polling people. If you polled your average American's view of China 15 years ago, 85% positive. Now, 15 or less % positive. That's how wars start. And so I'm sorry to be strong about this, but I'm really not a fan. I am a fan of globalization. I think it's been an extraordinary experiment in cooperation and in progress. Even the one that is the bad spillover of the environment, people forget it's because it succeeded. We have these environmental problems because people live longer, because there's 8 billion of us rather than 2 billion of us, because we eat more and are healthier, because we're able to travel, because we have material things that make us all well off. That doesn't justify the environmental destruction, obviously. And obviously the planet's more important than everyone having Netflix and microwave ovens and the other stuff. But the reason we have the problem isn't because we're all so poor, it's because we're all so rich. And that was globalization. And the idea that somehow we can just put that all into reverse and all be happy and get along, I just don't believe it. I think it's a mistake.
Great observations. We have 2 questions here on the floor, and then we'll come to the virtual, if that's okay. Anne?
Sorry, Anne, I think I missed one.
Great, thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you for your lecture, John. My question actually relates to the first question on growth, where I guess you said growth got us into this problem. It's going to get us out. Now, in the discourse, there's a small but growing literature on degrowth, and which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so I guess my question is what would happen, I guess, to the system? How would it respond if like a highly developed state, say, or states, say, you know, the Scandinavian countries, Finland, and that jazz, got together and just decided, you know what, we are content with our level of economic output. We're going to decrease our throughput output, maintain like a 0 level of growth, but maintain this level of development that we're at. How would the system respond? And sorry, there's one more small question is on a day-to-day basis, how often do you get signature jokes?
I thought I was going to escape without a signature joke. It's not even funny because honestly, I'll go to the United States and I'll be at a hotel. No, I have this. Let me just. Sorry, Anne. I'm going to go off. I'm tired. Actually, I have jet lag. But I was on an exchange program in Scotland when I was an undergraduate at Edinburgh, and I was in a room full of 40 students, exchange students, most of them American, all jet lagged, lying back in their seats, looking like they were half asleep. And the gentleman who was doing the list of who was here said he read off all the names. And my name wasn't there. And I knew this was coming. And I thought, oh my God, here we go. And he goes, in his Scottish accent, is there anyone here whose name hasn't been listed? And I put up my hand meekly. And he said, what's your name? I said, John. And he said, no, what's your whole name? And I said, John Hancock. Well, the Americans, they all woke up. Then they laughed. They were laughing so hard they were falling out of their seats. They couldn't believe anyone on the planet was named John Hancock. So I've suffered this. Thank you for asking that. Thanks for bringing it up. It's been a cause of suffering. Your growth question, I don't have an answer. But let's be realistic for a second. Let's even assume a really cooperative place like Finland or Sweden. They legislate there's going to be no more growth. We're all going to just stop here. How do you divide it up, right? So if you're living in the mansion and you have 3 cars and your boat in the harbor versus the person living in the inner city who has a fraction of that wealth, do you stop but then share that out and the rich person gives what they have to the poor person to make them feel equal? I just don't, I'm sorry, I just don't see it happening. I think I get it, but I just don't see how we do it. We had this conversation before, and I'm just going to repeat it, so sorry for people who've heard it already. There's this concept in economics called revealed preferences. And it's this idea that just because you say something, you say you like it, or you say you want it, or you believe in it, doesn't mean you do it. See what you do. That's an indication of how you behave. And my experience of the modern world is we are schizophrenic. On the surface, we all talk inclusion, sharing, cooperation, brother and sisterly love. And below the surface, we're actually very competitive still, very acquisitive, and very aspirational. And I see evidence of it everywhere, and it including globally. I just don't see anyone at this point, unless you're super well off or old like me, or you're a minority saying, I've got it all, I'm happy, I've had enough. But you know what? That's my generation talking. Your generation might be different. And in that case, good. The only one, let my last point, and I feel very strongly about this. You know, people are anti-markets. They're anti, free trade and globalization. And there's often you'll get this line, you know, it doesn't reflect, you know, we are all so greedy and we are all so money oriented that we need to get back to our values, you know, what we value. And values have been eclipsed by markets and by, moralless, purposeless, aimless consumption. And I don't see it that way. I think markets are an expression of value. I think the difference between a market and what other people are talking about is markets are highly democratic. They're actually saying you should decide what you want, not some bureaucrat, not some dictator, not some king or queen, or you should decide. And markets are simply the outcome of all of our millions and billions of choices, what we value. So if you're like my kids and you value immaterial things or recyclable water bottles or not taking airplanes anywhere, but doing conversations remotely, whatever it is, that's a market too. What sometimes people almost seem to get confused is they think that values is better than a market. And what it translates into, someone deciding what's best for you. I know what's best for you. You're actually not educated enough to make that choice. We'll decide that there's going to be no more growth. We'll decide that there's going to be no more travel or whatever. I worry sometimes that in the backlash against markets, it's kind of, there's an authoritarian streak to it, as if, you know, and it's an age-old thing. I was actually going to talk about this tonight, and I didn't get that far. But, you know, the Platonic ideal, all decisions should be made by experts. People, the best leader is an enlightened despot, a philosopher king who has been educated for decades, who lives a monastic life, who has a clearer vision than you have, or that you have, or you have, because we're just little people who are too kind of greedy and selfish and don't think. We need to hand it all over to someone who knows best. And I think one of the lessons of history is that they almost never know best. And they're almost always self-serving. They have their own agenda and their own interest. And their number one interest is to stay in power, to stay on the top. And I tend to be actually very trustful of people, your decisions, the masses of the decision, you know, the Aristotelian idea of the wisdom of the crowd. Markets are not bad. Markets are you guys deciding, as opposed to a bureaucrat or a regulator or a dictator or whatever. And I know that's not what you're saying, but I worry that when people say, oh, we're gonna have a no growth world, who decides that? whose decision is that? Who decides who gets what share of that? If you think about it long enough, there can be a scary side to that.
If I may press the point on this growth versus no growth argument, there's a very fundamental, difficult underlying challenge and issue here as well, and that relates to the inequities that exist both within our societies and globally, and how,
right,
what may be an approach that would allow a more equitable world in terms of income distribution and what have you. And if you do not have growth, would that be possible? That's another important question to answer. Now, you could be cynical and say, yes, this globalization created vast amount of wealth and we still have inequity, but perhaps our social and political processes have not caught up with the ability to find a way to make that thing equitably distributed. That's an important discussion. But the growth, no growth argument is a futile one in my view. Anyway, I'm not supposed
Without
to.
saying that, I'm not saying you're
opinion.
wrong. I get what you're saying, but I think we have to think out what it means actually. And my hope is that humans will decide collectively to do the right thing. I actually think they will.
Yeah.
There are some people, you know, who actually, I mean, Richard, you're the expert in this, but you know, who say that actually what we need on this energy transition and the green is starting to happen. People are starting to make the right decision, and the technologies are coming on stream. People are getting inventive, creative, and beginning to think of ways to solve the problem. Maybe it's too late. Maybe it's not enough. Certainly, if the world continues on my generation's stuff, and it's not just the 500 million in the West, but 8 billion get as much stuff as I had, then we've got a real problem. But I'm a bit of an optimist on that. And again, it's the knowledge thing.
We have 3 questions here, so we will take them. We do need, I'm keeping a tab on the time, and we have 3 questions from the virtual audience. So we'll go 1, 1, 1, 1 like that, and then try and bring the session to a close. So please, your question briefly, if possible.
Sure. I was just wondering, we're sitting this era that we have this international kind of economic system, and where no one has really control. And I'm wondering that within this environment, what institutions like the European Union kind of have in kind of mitigating this between, right, where we have anarchy, but an international system. And if we should see things like the East African community or some form of that in Latin America, and these kind of trade blocs act as intermediaries between the local and the international, and where they act economically, but also with political cohesion. One thing I could think of is like the Brussels effect and how the European Union has been more effective in going against like meta policies, or how Apple has been acting. Like in a lot of these have knock-on effects on social corporate responsibilities. Right. So I was just wondering if you have any insights or thoughts on how these institutions might be the future and kind of mediating all these things.
That's an excellent question. And I'm not going to be able to give you too satisfying an answer. A superficial answer is right up until Brexit, the European Union was suffering exactly the same problems I was explaining. I mean, really, it was in bad shape. There was repeat, you know, the Greek debt crisis after crisis. Germany not willing to be the bagman for the whole. We all know that. You know, the one good thing about Brexit, and there aren't many, is that it's scared the hell out of every other European country. And suddenly the European Union's looking pretty good. And everyone's sort of pointing at, well, we could be worse. We could be them. So Brexit's had that advantage. But I think your basic point is a more important one. I think one of the great European concepts is this notion of subsidiarity. In other words, where you need to make a decision, or you need to have political oversight or some kind of administrative management, keep it as decentralized as possible. If the city-state can do it, let the city-state do it. If the district and the city-state can do it, let the district do it. Try to avoid centralizing everything and putting everything on top. And I think that is one of the problems with the international system we did not get to, and I did talk about. They overpromise. They don't, you know, when they're up there, they don't know what's going on. And you're absolutely right. Maybe we should start devolving it to stronger regional organizations. And then, you know, the nation state, the province, whatever. But the point is, I think the subsidiary idea is a great idea. And it's classic Weberian bureaucracy and power. Humans like power. They accumulate power. They want more power. So if you're sitting at the G20 or the UN, or, you know, almost every answer is give us more money and power. And I think you're right. In a way, that's not the right answer. Some things have to be coordinated at the top, but maybe this decentralization of authority is a good thing.
We'll go to the next question from the virtual audience.
And just in the interest of time, John, because there are so many questions, I'm going to summarize a couple, okay? There's great interest in fertility rates, declining fertility rates, and demographically, the diminished birth rate in China, which is forecasted to lead to the halving of the population in 2050. Wow. So, in the growth trajectories. So, could you comment on that? And there is interest in technology. Does there need to be an urgent consensus to make sure it's not divisive?
Which technology?
Technology development and proliferation. Lastly, and I'd like to read this question because it has to do with economic theory. Your comments on computer trading speeds made me wonder about John Maynard Keynes's statement about the economy. Quote, "The position is serious when enterprise becomes a bubble on a whirlpool of speculation. It feels like we are at that point, with the whirlpool of speculation absorbing basic aspects of housing, health, and education, where speculation and profit seem to be exhausting our ability to protect the most social basic needs. Do you see that this as a problem or a view which is overblown?"
Wow, that's a tough one. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and I'm sorry, I feel like I've talked too much. So I'll try to keep it short. So fertility, this is one where I really need to fix again. I'm going to get into trouble. You know, I got to say, I read all these articles about China declining birth rate, Italy replication rate of 1, a ratio of 1, and the population shrinking by half every generation. Personally, I think bring it on. Great. Why is this a problem? You know, we are living out what Malthus warned about 250 years ago, right? I mean, the Malthusian idea. The problem with humans is they reproduce too much. You know, what he was really saying, he was a minister, so he couldn't say they like sex too much and they can't control themselves. And they're like bacteria in a petri dish. You'll give them more food, they'll just expand until they starve and fall off. And then everyone, you know, who was watching this said, well, Malthus was wrong. Look, we're so inventive. We can think of new ways to come up with food, new ways to produce metal. And, you know, this is a repeated debate throughout history. Now you kind of look at anything, 8 billion people going to top out, Don told me, at 10 billion. Is that right, Don? In 2050. Take an airplane, I do, sorry, I should, and fly over Central Asia and look down during the day or look down at night. It is a giant farm. We have turned our wildernesses into farms or suburbs or cities. We have taken over the planet. And it's, I don't want to get into the Gaia philosophy or whatever, but it's just unsustainable. And in any event, why don't we limit our growth? And there, the great thing, we've talked about this, I talked about this earlier today, but I think I believe in feminism strongly because I have a wife and a daughter, and it's a human right. And it's outrageous that for centuries it didn't happen. And it's the most important revolution that's happened in the last 200 years. And the added benefit is that educated women don't want to have 10 babies and be under the thumb of their husband and stay at home and not go to school and not have a career. They want to go to school, have a career, have a job, and then have their children later or not at all. And you know, there's study after study on this, the correlation between education of women and economic well-being, economic growth, stronger societies, and especially lower fertility. And I think this is another example. You know, when I went to school, was in university, it was a ratio of 4 to 1 men to women. Now I'm sure it's flipped and it's 3 women to 2 guys. Women are increasingly in the engineering faculties, dominating the medical faculties a lot. And bring it on. This is good. And on the fertility thing, I think the answer is going to be exactly that. It's no coincidence that the highest fertility rates are in the lowest socioeconomic areas of the world and with the least education. They're not in, you know, in Finland. They're not in Japan for sure. And China is going to do this. And I think the worst argument is the idea, well, you know, if we don't have a lot of kids, who's going to pay for our pensions? Who's going to look after us? You know, that the answer to that is, and when they get old, who's going to look after them? I mean, we're going to have another 4 billion people to look after those old. We've got to get through this demographic transition of a lot more older people than young people than we're used to. But once we get through that, I think it's better. What was the second question, Anne? It was. Oh, right. No, that is a super tough question. I do not have an easy answer to that, except to say, you know, what's the famous Paul Samuelson line? You know, I successfully predicted 9 of the last 3 recessions. Our ability to project the future of economies is almost nil. I mean, we'd be better off going to Vegas and putting bets on the tables rather than, you know, there's that great John Maynard, you know, Galbraith line, you know, economic forecasts exist to make astrologers look good. And I mean, it's, okay. So I don't know what's going to happen, but there is some sense that there's our bubbles.
We're coming to a close to our session. Let's try and get this 2 questions on the floor here. Is that okay, Anne? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I'm wondering how you conceptualize the role of the fourth world, the indigenous state within the state, and the increasing coordination of indigenous peoples across the boundaries of the nation state, sitting in the fora of the nation state. And how salient do you see that, or do you see that becoming within the structure of the international political economy?
Wow, that's a good question. This is so beyond my expertise. I mean, I think it's a bit like the decentralization question. I actually think it's a good thing if there's transboundary commonality amongst certain people and certain interests. I think that's a good thing, and it's a kind of a re-globalization that people are not talking about, and it is becoming real. So what you're describing, I think, in principle, sounds positive. You know, it just triggers a thought, and I'll just throw it out there. I mean, I do think one of the problems, it gets to this point about one of the tensions between sovereignty and transnationalism. You know, I see this all the time in organizations. One of the problems at the international level is nation states reflect their interests. It's impossible to think that a Canadian delegate's going to go to a meeting. He or she might have a sense of a global public good or a global crisis, but in the end, they're answerable to Canadian voters. That's who get them elected. They're not answerable to Chinese voters, or well, if there were Chinese voters, or Indonesian voters. But that places a limit on what you can do cooperatively. If you're always going to the table in some kind of mercantilist bargain, you know, my interest, your interest, let's see where we come. Sometimes these transboundary coalitions are good things. So if that's what you're saying, I think it's a good idea.
Last question, please, from the audience here.
Thank you so much. You can hear me, yes? Awesome. My question is technology specific. It links in with your theme because I really appreciated when no one is in charge and what happens. And I'm not looking for a definitive answer. I'd like some advice in terms of specifically, you hear it in the news, the use of biometric technology and its use by different nations and the vested interest of people that are using it on an international level, controlling migration of populations. This is an unregulated field, and it's a technology that's kind of growing out of control. What would your advice be in terms of, if you were asked, give us some advice into how can we come up with ideas, solutions, or at least the first couple of steps in trying to rein in how this technology is proliferating in its use on a global scale?
What is, please just, sorry, I'm doing this here. What was the technology you're asking?
The use of biometric technology.
Right.
Biometrics.
Wow. Again, I'm sorry, this is outside of my expertise scope, but this is the point I'm going to make. I think right now, technology and science and engineering largely are what's defining international relations massively. In a way we don't even know. That's part of my argument tonight. You know, I would say, what is, and Anne and I talked about this last night, what is the most important, most powerful, most pervasive system of global governance in the world today? What is it? It's the internet. I mean, by far. It's changed how we share information. It's changed how we communicate. It's destabilized democracies. It's put a geopolitical system in flux. It's massive. And no one runs it. I mean, there's literally, there's regulators, largely in the United States, who are kind of obscure. No one protests the internet. It's like, oh, you know, it's the amount of protests against the internet. They don't even know where it is. It's not there. And yet it's the most powerful thing. So my point is, A, I don't think anyone really fully grasps what its impact is. We're at the beginning of it. And secondly is, we should be populating these kinds of discussions with engineers and scientists and experts, not people like me. So we need to get the scientists into the room to tell us what's going on, and the engineers. And I have to say, one area, and there aren't many, where China has an advantage over us, partly because they're undemocratic. They're all scientists and engineers in that government. They're not people like me. One reason they don't have a debate about climate change in China is because they're all scientists and they trust the science. Unlike the US Congress, where, you know, DeSantis or something like that, well, God knows. I mean, who knows what he studied, but they don't know. So it's a very good question. Now, in terms of the actual, I'm not even going to attempt to give you an answer, except to say that the system needs actual people who either built it or understand it or developed, and that goes for business people too, right? I mean, I'm sorry, that's the best answer I can
John,
come up with.
On that wonderful note, I think we'll bring this session to an end. Faith in reason and science perhaps might be our unifying force. Wonderful, thank you. Your talk was great, but your answers in the Q&A were even better still. So you're hired.
Look, I want to thank you guys. Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure. What a great city and a super nice audience. Thank you.
One last act to follow. Anne is going to close this meeting. So you just hang in here. And thank you again for a wonderful chat.
I'm not going to close the meeting because I think you did a great job, Jitin, already, but I am going to call on Madison Lee, who has a small token of our appreciation for your efforts to travel here from Geneva and to spend time with our students today and to address such a great audience tonight. So once again, thank you so much, John.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you again for joining us. There are desserts and treats and refreshments outside. Please help yourself or take some home. Thank you.